Hello and welcome to our June third-party Roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, Jon Cassell, here to give us an inside look on the newest third-party patch releases. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat, and Jon will reach out after to answer those. And with that, Jon Cassell.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending. Today, I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party products that have received updates since the start of the month. Although there have been a number of security bulletins and advisories in June, it again actually ended up being a pretty light month, and that's of course great news for my audience. However, we do have a number of zero-day exploits to cover on this webcast. Also, for most third-party applications, before we start, I always want to mention we have absolutely no idea when they'll actually be provided by vendors. Most manufacturers actually have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, Microsoft, of course, has been using the second Tuesday of the month for over a decade now, and some manufacturers have actually followed suit, such as Adobe. Let's briefly discuss actually what a vulnerability is versus what is a patch, or what an update actually does. A vulnerability is a bug or a misconfiguration in a product, application, or an operating system that, if exploited, allows that product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or an update is instead a piece of software or code published by the vendor of that product or system to resolve the vulnerability. And with that being said, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. If a vulnerability exists in a product or system, but no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit. And before we get into those latest updates since the month started, how do we prioritize them? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. The first one being vendor severity. And this typically ranges from critical to not applicable. And they typically go through, use terms like severity or sometimes priority, like we'll be looking at with Adobe today. And as well, comes directly again from the manufacturer of that update. It is important to always check the vendor severity of any update. However, do bear in mind that it can clearly be a biased rating. You're getting the information directly from the manufacturer, and of course, they always want to talk good about their own product. Many third-party updates don't receive severities, again, because it would highlight that product or application in a negative light. To combat this, we instead prioritize more heavily the industry severity, such as the CVSS score, or the Common Vulnerability Security System. Scoring system, calculated by an independent organization. The score ranges from 0 to 10, with 10 being the most severe and critical. The higher the rating, the higher it typically entails higher possibility of exploitation. Then we deal with the state of the vulnerability, such as weaponization. This means that it's actually being actively exploited in the wild and can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. These are ones we might read an article on. We'll hear about something dropped same day. Articles typically, even then, are probably too late to get to the industry to let you know about it. But these are always possibilities. And whenever you hear about a zero-day exploit, like we'll be talking about today, do make sure that you're checking up on that product and resolving it if a resolution is available. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means that the structure or the blueprint of that bug has also been exposed to the industry. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's being exploited or, well, like we mentioned earlier, weaponized, but that the details are out there on how to weaponize it. And these are typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, or even sometimes the manufacturer. Pretty rare, but it's a possibility. If you happen to go to security conferences like Black Hat, RSA, or some others, you might actually hear about something being disclosed at that conference as part of their spiel, something that, of course, is something that we're sitting down and listening to. It might actually provide, they might provide that proof of concept, which we hadn't heard about prior to that actual briefing. Now, countermeasures are also a possibility that are provided in a few different ways. Either a mitigation, such as a configuration from, say, an antivirus or an EDR that is stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying a patch. And the other countermeasure is a workaround. such as a registry, policy, or service configuration change that also prevents that vulnerability from being exploited. Great example of this is when Microsoft recommends or provides a recommended policy or a registry change without the need to actually deploy some type of out-of-band update. Administrators love this, especially in the infrastructure side, as wise typically we'll see it more like that from Microsoft, where there might be a simple change to a service for a DNS server, or maybe a quick change on the DHCP server, or maybe a domain controller, without the need to actually have to down it like we would expect from typical updates from the manufacturer. And finally, the sixth factor in determining our strategy is the exposure of this and the breakdown based on what our tool or solution is being used to detect and report on any outstanding vulnerabilities across the device fleet. Now, when it comes to exposure, we also want something that's going to resolve it. So we can identify all the time. Plenty of products out there, plenty of solutions, but do make sure that you have something that will actually provide a full solution, not just to detect and identify, but also to allow you to resolve the situation. Every environment's different, and it typically includes various versions of operating systems as well. So whatever you have under your belt, whatever you have in the environment, make sure your product also supports it. Nothing should be left out there. Knowing where said vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target our endpoints for remediation. All right, so the third-party products we'll be discussing today have all received updates since the month started. We'll talk about a few outliers as well, and all resolve some sort of vulnerability. There are plenty of other products we could discuss, but I do want to focus on the security side of things as we go through the third-party update roundup. So again, all of them are going to include some type of security fix, as well as some dreaded zero-day exploits as mentioned earlier. Also, all products mentioned do have advisories from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, to update as soon as possible. First, Adobe dropped a number of updates for Windows, Mac OS, and cloud services. It's the one I always include first because it's one of the only manufacturers where I can guarantee I know I'm going to hear about it on Patch Tuesday along with Microsoft. Adobe has chosen to release monthly their advisory on the same exact date. This month, they patched 4 of their products: Experience Manager, Commerce, Animate, and Substance 3D Designer. And actually another reason why I also include them, and typically first, is unfortunately they do have a lot of critical advisories typically. We're not going to see much of that today, which is actually great when we're talking about these 4 products if they happen to apply to you, but they have had a number of critical advisories, sad to say, year after year for many years now. So it's why I always, of course, mention them first. Okay, so the first product, Experience Manager, received an update to resolve 4 separate vulnerabilities, ranging from 3.5 to 5.4 CVSS scores, which is good. Not the typical critical as we see month after month, but if you happen to be using the product, of course, you should be a little concerned. These include cross-site scripting and URL redirection bugs. However, again, all are only rated moderate to important. Adobe patched Commerce for 12 separate vulnerabilities, so a higher number, with most receiving lower CVSS scores of 2.7 to 6.5. However, 2 of the vulnerabilities in the total list regarding incorrect authorization and cross-site scripting were assigned critical severity with CVSS scores of 7.5 and actually a 9.1 respectively. So if you happen to be using Commerce, you should be more concerned, not just because it has more fixes than the other products, but because of that 9.1 score that is critical. If any of the vulnerabilities are exploited, they can lead to security feature bypass or arbitrary file system read. And the critical vulnerability can lead to arbitrary code execution, one that we typically see as how Adobe products can be exploited, what it leads to. Adobe Animate received a Windows and Mac OS patch to resolve a single use after free vulnerability rated as critical by the vendor, however, with only a CVSS score of 7.8. But if exploited, could also lead to arbitrary code execution. This update applies to Animate 22.0.9 or 23.0.1 in earlier versions. Lastly, Substance 3D Designer also received a patch for Windows and Mac OS devices to resolve a single access of uninitialized pointer vulnerability rated at critical, also with a CVSS score of 7.8, that if exploited could again lead to arbitrary code execution. The Adobe vendor advisory, so when we were talking earlier about the vendor severity, this is what Adobe recommends. They do have their own priority, they call it. It was pretty standard, as they stamped all of their products with a lesser priority of 3. So they do have their own priority system, and as well, they have flipped the model. So not the higher, or rather that you go up is more critical. Actually, the higher the number, the better. Means that it's far less likely for exploitation. If you happen to see a vendor priority, Adobe priority of 1, you should definitely be very concerned. But there's typically other information to support it, such as weaponization mentioned earlier, would probably also be a factor into why they gave it that higher or lower number, that higher score. Given that all Adobe products had multiple critical advisories, these fixes should not be overlooked, and any affected Adobe users should, of course, prioritize patching if it has not already been done. Google Chrome has had 3 desktop releases for Windows, Mac OS, and Linux in the month of June, as well as a single release specific to Windows Server administrators. However, before we discuss June, there was also a major release just after last month's webcast, and I wanted to first highlight it. It was literally right after last month's call, so I think it was 2 hours after it had dropped, but it's technically in May, but I do want to mention it anyways. On the 30th, Google took Chrome to version 1.14 and released an update to resolve 16 documented security fixes, with 13 being reported by external researchers. 8 of those that were reported were flagged as high severity and included fixes for out-of-bounds write, use after free flaws, out-of-bounds memory access, and type confusion issues in their V8 JavaScript engine, with lesser issues resolving inappropriate implementation as well as insufficient data validation. Google ended up forking out $65,500 US in bug bounties for those 13 disclosed vulnerabilities. Circling back to this month, our first update dropped on June 5th, and it resolved a high severity vulnerability tracked as CVE 2023-3079 regarding another type confusion issue in the V8 JavaScript engine. However, should all be concerned, as this is Chrome's 3rd 0-day for 2023, as Google is aware that an exploit exists in the wild. On 0 days with Chrome, looking back, and I mentioned this month after month, as of course it's interesting, 2021 was a very tough year for Google Chrome users, as the browser had 16 0-day exploits in that given year. Last year, there were only 9, although that's a pretty high number still. Now that we're midway through this year, 3 0 days is looking much better, and I hope it continues this way. Moving on, another update for Chrome dropped on June 8th, specifically for Windows Server at 2012 and 2012 R2 systems specifically, as Google stopped supporting Windows 7, 8, and 8.1 and respective server versions since Chrome 110 was released. So they're all stuck on 109. However, back in October, Google stated to, and quote, to ease customer transitions, critical security fixes, and fixes for bugs where they are aware of exploits in the wild will be issued to Chrome 109 on Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2 until October of this year. And definitely is because it's still such a huge market share, as so many administrators are still continuing to use those systems. And yes, they're still using Chrome, or administrators like using Chrome on those boxes still. If you're still running older versions of Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, just like Windows 8 and 8.1 respectively, and you prefer Chrome as your browser on your server, be sure to remove it later this year, because come October, you'll no longer be supported by Google and you will have a permanent vulnerability. You want to choose a new browser on that operating system. And you should probably think about a new operating system as well. It's definitely out of date. There are newer versions of Windows Server that are, of course, available. The next stable channel update for Chrome Desktop dropped on June 13th to resolve 5 security fixes, with 4 being reported by external researchers. One of these fixes was rated as critical regarding a use after free flaw in autofill payments, while the other 3 were all rated as simply high severity. Bug bounties haven't been paid out in this release. Just checked just now. Haven't been paid out entirely, but so far $3,000 US was paid to an external researcher for a use after free flaw in WebRTC. So we might see that number jump, but it was only a handful of potentials that are still in the to be determined state. A few weeks passed, and our last Chrome update of the month dropped just yesterday, resolving 4 security flaws, with 3 of them being publicly disclosed by external researchers. All 3 disclosed vulnerabilities are rated as high severity, related to use after free issues and another type confusion bug in the V8 JavaScript engine, which is, if you've heard that before, of course, it's a very common engine of the browser, and it is typically exploited, usually month after month. Astonishingly, between just 3 flaws, Google paid out $35,000 US in bug bounties just for yesterday's fixes, and none are actually outstanding. That is the full amount for yesterday's release. Every month I mention that Chrome is by far the most popular web browser, and that it, of course, makes it a malicious attacker's preferred target, not just for, of course, consumers, but businesses too. Regarding updating it, as always, the browser should auto-update for any consumers or users that have full control of their system, but administrators, please be sure to double check and update accordingly, especially if those end users don't have administrative rights to the devices. And remember that if you're still running it on an older Windows Server version, it is unsupported after October of this year. Following suit, any vulnerabilities resolved in Chrome also affect other Chromium-based browsers, such as the increasingly popular Microsoft Edge. Edge received 7 updates since the month started. The June 2nd update of Edge included a number of enhancements, new policies, and of course, security fixes. With this monthly feature release, Edge Workspaces has finally publicly released, providing, end quote, a way for users to organize their browsing tasks into dedicated windows. From their release notes, Microsoft mentioned that Edge Workspaces lets users share a set of browser tabs so working groups can view the same websites and latest working files in one place and stay on the same page. Each Edge workspace contains its own set of tabs and favorites, all created and curated by the user and their collaborators. They're also automatically saved and kept up to date. I should also mention that admins do retain the ability to still control and customize these new features as needed with additional settings, as well as there are also 2 new policies added in this release, including manipulating the standalone sidebar and the downloads button on the toolbar. In the same update, 2 Edge-specific vulnerabilities were addressed. The first is tracked as CVE 2023-29345 and is related to a security feature bypass issue, and it's been given a CVSS score of 6.1, marking it just barely as high severity, but still a little concerning. Fortunately, as well, it has not been exploited, and Microsoft also claims that exploitation is less likely. The second vulnerability, tracked as CVE 2023-33143, is related to elevation of privilege and has been given a higher CVSS score of 7.5. But Microsoft also claims that exploitation is less likely. The next updates dropped on June 6th and 8th to resolve the same Chrome 0-day mentioned earlier, with a June 13th update released for M109 Windows down level extended support, like mentioned earlier, regarding those older versions of Windows. However, contrary to Chrome only providing an update for older Windows Server versions, Edge is still supported on Windows 7, 8, 8.1, as well as the 2012 server versions. Moving forward, the June 15th release of Edge rolled Web Select into Web Capture and can be accessed by using the Control-Shift-X shortcut. Additionally, the web select policy was deprecated because of the consolidation. The 15th update also had resolved another Edge-specific vulnerability, tracked as CVE 2023-33145, related to information disclosure. This flaw has a higher CVSS of 6.5, but again is less likely for exploitation. And the last Edge update dropped on the 22nd. Microsoft only mentions that it fixed various bugs and performance issues for the stable and extended stable release. I had to check that this morning, as last night they had no information on their website yet regarding yesterday's version, but they since amended that to say that it was actually dropped on the 22nd. Given that multiple Edge-specific vulnerabilities are clearly present and all of the Chromium critical, high severity, and zero-day fixes still apply here, do be sure to prioritize at least identification of the versions that are on your network or on your device, and make sure that the newest versions are there when you get a chance. Mozilla Firefox, still pretty popular out there, released 3 updates since last month, including an additional update for extended support release users. Mozilla first dropped a Firefox update on June 6th, bringing Firefox to version 1.14 and included 2 high severity fixes out of a total of only 3 CVEs. The other one was a moderate, by the way. This version also added a number of improvements, such as adding UI to manage the DNS over HTTPS exceptions list. Bookmarks can now be searched from the bookmarks menu, which I think is hilarious that didn't exist before. Searches can be restricted to local browsing history. Mac OS users can now capture video from their cameras in all supported native resolutions, and it's now possible to reorder the extensions listed in the extensions panel, which is again another funny yet very, very late improvement, obviously. And then as well, there were a few other changes in this release. Firefox version 114.0.1 resolved startup crash bugs, and 114.0.2 resolved additional crash issues. So typically don't talk about those additional revisions that happen after the major one, but given that there are a number of crash issues there, just make sure if you're using Firefox that you're also up to date so it doesn't happen to you if you happen to be on browsers or websites through your browser with sensitive data. Although not as popular, of course, as Chrome to exploit, it is still popular out there for many administrators and consumers. This month did include some high severity fixes, and I'd of course recommend updating if that applies to you. I also like to quickly mention, as it's been requested in the past to discuss Mozilla Thunderbird, that it received a single update since last month resolving similar high severity issues as Firefox 1.14, among other application enhancements. There was one additional high severity bug fixed with the latest versions of, or the latest version of Mozilla Thunderbird. Some additional products that have also seen updates since the start of the year, but again, nothing in this space to really disclose. Otherwise, I'd have more detailed information on them. These products include 7-Zip, Audacity, Bitwarden, Dropbox, Jenkins, KeyPass, Malwarebytes, Notepad++, Opera, RealVNC, Skype, Slack, TeamViewer, WebEx, WinSCP, and Zoom. As always, my monthly reminder to all administrators and consumers too, please include third-party patching in your patch deployment process or as part of your typical routine to make sure that all updates are applied. Of course, any and all applications installed can be considered a potential vulnerability. I've mentioned this a few times in the past. Operating system updates only account for roughly 20 to maybe 30% of vulnerabilities that are out there. So it's not just about everything that you're getting directly from Microsoft or from Apple or from your Linux repository, but those third-party apps can also be a concern. It's a much larger chunk out there as you're now dealing with multiple manufacturers and the bugs that they have unfortunately released. Finally, and yet again, another very, very unfortunate month for Apple users. Sad to say, a number of products were given update advisories in the last week to resolve 3 actively exploited bugs across macOS. macOS versions iOS, iPadOS, watchOS, and Safari. And this is very interesting this month too. The first of the zero-day bugs is a kernel flaw, tracked as CVE 2023 32434, where an app may be able to execute arbitrary code with kernel privileges. This was reported by multiple researchers, with Russian anti-malware vendor Kaspersky following the public documentation of, quote, Operation Triangulation, which is a digital spy campaign that used zero-click iMessage exploits. I got a bit of this information from Security Week directly. Interestingly, Kaspersky's disclosure came on the same day that Russia's Federal Security Service also blamed U.S. intelligence agencies for an ongoing spy campaign targeting thousands of iOS devices belonging to domestic subscribers and foreign diplomatic missions. Coincidence? This bug exists in all supported versions of macOS, iOS, iPadOS, and watchOS. The second bug to be exploited is a type confusion WebKit flaw tracked as CVE 2023 32439, where processing web content may lead to arbitrary code execution. This bug applies to macOS Ventura, iOS, and iPadOS 15 and 16, as well as Safari 16, and it was reported by simply an anonymous researcher. The third and final vulnerability, and these are all, by the way, I prioritize these I'm listing these in order of how many products they overall affected. The third and final one is tracked as CVE 2023 32435, where a memory corruption bug in WebKit could lead to arbitrary code execution when processing maliciously crafted web content, and it was addressed with improved state management. The third bug was only specific to iOS and iPadOS versions 15, and was also reported by the Kaspersky team as part of that same documentation. Apple stated that they are aware, of course, for all of these that are reports that the issues may have been actively exploited for all the flaws mentioned previously. And I know Apple doesn't really count as a third-party product, of course, the main purpose of this webinar, but it is another manufacturer, so it does somewhat count. But I did want to cover it on this webcast again, unfortunately, for the fourth month in a row, to inform my macOS audience, since this additional advisory addresses some pretty serious zero-day vulnerabilities with an interesting backstory as well. Of course, for any other third-party products on Apple devices, be sure to check your App Store and update accordingly. If it says anything is available, make sure that it is updated. I hope that this has been informational, or informative and useful to everyone. And as well, if you enjoy the form of this webcast or not, please contact us and let us know. If you have any further questions, concerns, or suggestions for improvement, we would absolutely love to hear it. And as well, if there's something or a particular product that I didn't mention today that maybe fell outside of scope, something you'd like to hear more about as well, do you want to keep my audience happy and of course updated on everything out there, please let us know about those as well. Of course, we talk about a lot of popular products, but as well, the more popular, probably the more vulnerabilities that are there, the more the industry is talking about them. But I'm happy to talk about other solutions as well, other products and other solutions as well. Thanks for your time. And as I always like to say, happy patching.